Today we're talking about hi-hats. Believe it or not, how you have your hats adjusted can have a huge effect on how they sound. Don't let your stand adjustment keep you from getting an optimum cymbal sound. Hey everybody, welcome to the Non-Glamorous Drummer, the channel all about giving you the non-glamorous drum tips to really help you to become a better player. If you're new to the channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Hey, by the way, welcome to my sunroom here, full of natural daylight so I can be lazy and not set up my studio lights to film. So let's head down to the kit and let's learn more about adjusting our hats. Okay, so we've really got these 5 main adjustment points. Really the last point isn't quite an adjustment point, but it's a really important, really big one that the first 4 points are going to lead up to. Let's start off with sort of a pretty important adjustment point, hi-hat distance apart. How much does that affect the sound? How important is that? Do we need to have them closer together, further together? So I have mine right here, as you can see. I think this is sort of a sweet spot, but let me show you why. If we were to go closer, like maybe right here, you might think that if you're playing a lot of like keeping time with your left foot a lot in the middle of a groove, if you're doing that, you might think, okay, it makes sense to have them closer together so it doesn't take as much effort to maybe play quicker. But that's not necessarily true, and the sound isn't as great when you do that. You end up compromising the overall sound quality by having them too close together. On the flip side, if we have them too far apart, then it's really a lot of leg motion that has to happen to really close things all the way. And it can even be difficult to actually put enough pressure to really close them, and the pedal is almost touching the floor or the bottom of the hi-hat pedal frame. So we don't really want that, so that's too much. So that's how I've kind of settled on this spot in between, like roughly, yeah, right here. I think this is perfect. And because I know somebody's gonna ask, so right here on this side, my hi-hats are exactly 1 1/8 and 1/8 apart. And of course that changes as you move around because they're not exactly parallel to each other, which we're gonna talk about in a minute. But just to give you a good starting point, a good guideline, this is a good spot to have them. Number 2, clutch looseness. Now this is big because, by the way, what I mean by clutch looseness is not how tight the clutch is attached to the rod, but how loosely the cymbal is able to move within the clutch. And by the way, just a quick like hi-hat clutch 101 in case you just got a drum set or you're not familiar with how this works. So there's this piece right here that screws down and it reaches a stopping point where it can't go any further. So you want to keep that tight. There's even an additional screw that can go in right here you can use to secure that extra where you know it's not going to go anywhere. So now you can use these top 2 nuts to adjust how tight or how loose the hi-hat actually is on the clutch. So let's do both extremes. First we'll go super tight. So by screwing these down, the hi-hats are going to start to move less. It's going to get stiffer and stiffer. Let's see how that sounds. It's okay, it works. What happens is as soon as we start to loosen them, it doesn't take long before hitting them causes the top one to just vibrate by itself and not interact with the lower one. The top one needs to be loose enough to be able to sizzle with the lower one to really get that hi-hat sizzle sound that we want. Now on the flip side, if we go super loose with it, this will be really loose. It's great because now we can get that sloshy sound by just barely lifting up our foot. But the only problem with it being this loose is when we're playing time with our foot, it's kind of hard to control it. See how even if I keep my hands on here, the rod, the clutch, there's so much extra space here, it's able to move up and down without actually moving the cymbals, which means there's going to be some lag and some unresponsiveness. And so we want to make sure we have complete control, so we really don't want it to be this loose. We really want to find that sweet spot, and that's really what this is all about, finding the sweet spot, experiment with your hi-hats, with your stand, with your playing style, and find that spot you like. For me, it's right here, so I can get the sloshy sound quickly. But I also have control. And there's barely some movement there, not nearly as much as we did have where this was moving independent of the hi-hat. So I think this is a good in-between spot. Number 3, this is a really important one. Bottom hi-hat angle. Kind of alluded to that a minute ago when I was saying, well, when you measure the distance apart, it's going to be different as you move around the cymbals because they're not necessarily going to be parallel. You don't want them to be parallel. We want them to be able to interact and sizzle with each other, which means we don't want them both to be totally parallel. We'll see if we can adjust it where they're parallel so you can hear that so you'll know what I'm talking about. So right now they're pretty much parallel. And it still sounds okay. but it's a much quieter closing sound. It's a much quieter chicking sound. And so really it's kind of wimpy. Like if we're playing jazz, the ride's overpowering that, and that 2 and 4 isn't really cutting through. But if we change the angle and we start twisting this wing nut here, so we lift up the back side of the lower hat, now there's some angle so they can really slap onto each other like that rather than square on. It's still not quite as much as I'd want. A lot of cymbals aren't evenly weighted from side to side, and so you might even find that one side of the cymbal wants to droop a little lower, so you can play around with that too. That's definitely, I'd say that's better. Moral of the story there, don't let them be totally parallel. Play with that bottom hat angle so that they're slightly offsetting each other. Overall stand height. Now I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this because it's not a huge deal, but you don't want to have your hi-hats crazy high where you're having to reach up awkwardly. I know the tendency is to do that to give your left hand more space underneath your right hand, but you don't want to have crazy spread. I've liked having mine a little bit lower. I used to have mine higher. I like having them lower. I've been playing around with keeping my right hand out here so my right hand isn't even crossing over my left. That's a topic for another video. I'll definitely talk about that some more later. I like having the hi-hats lower so that I'm able to play a more comfortable angle on them. Play around with that height. It really depends on what style of music you're playing. If you're playing jazz and you're playing more on top of the cymbals, or you're playing like light Latin bossa nova stuff, you can get by with them much lower. If you're playing rock though, you're probably going to want them a little higher. I think I'd go for an in-between, which might even be on the lower side of in-between, especially if you look at how high I could go on this hi-hat stand. That would be crazy. So that leads us to number 5, which is really less of an adjustment point, but more of just a bringing those 4 adjustment points all together into talking about playing technique. So I'll just start by saying this. If you want to play smoothly and quickly and more effortlessly on the hi-hat, especially if you're playing like 16th note grooves, something along the lines of if you're wanting to play something like that, you definitely want to keep the stick somewhat close to the edge where it's maybe no more than 2 inches up onto the cymbal, because any further and you start to lose rebound and it starts to get a little bit more clumsy and heavy. Of course, if you're playing on the very top, then there's all the rebound. But you quickly start to lose that and have to put a lot more wrist and a lot more energy into it. So really it depends on what feel, what sound, what playing style you're going for here. If you're playing a quick 16th note groove or like a shuffle, if you're doing that, you definitely want to be a little more on top. But if you're playing something heavier, like something heavier or maybe even laid back and really big feeling, then you can definitely get by with really digging in like that. So it all depends on really what kind of speed or dynamic you're going for there. I know for me, this really helped me break past a plateau where I was just getting tired and I felt like my hi-hat playing wasn't smooth until I found that sweet spot about right here. Where I felt like I could just glide along much more effortlessly compared to where that takes a lot more risk because you don't have the rebound working for you. Instead, you're having to work against the fact that the cymbals are absorbing the stick motion. Okay, now this last thing, this is really the most important subtopic of number 5. Make your open hat notes interesting and not boring. So I'm going to play a simple groove with an open hat thing, a closed hat groove with an open hat note in the middle of it. First, I'm going to play it the boring way, and then I'm going to play it the more interesting musical way, and then we'll break down what the differences are. So that was the boring way. Nothing wrong with it. It was clean. It was fine, but I think it's a little uninteresting. Here's a more interesting way to play that exact same groove. Could you hear the difference? And it was all in that one open hat note and the way I played it. We'll isolate just that. Here's the first way that I played it. Here's the second way. So really the only difference is that second time, rather than opening it and then hitting it, I was hitting it when they're slightly loose and then opening it more as the duration of that note goes. So instead of, I was doing, and so it's kind of like starting it here and then opening it up, so it's like a, or you can almost think of it as a sucking sound. But you can really hear that difference there, and that makes it so much more interesting. Yeah, it's a little bit more of a challenge to play that way, but the more you practice it, the more you do it, the more natural it feels. And so I try to, every time I ever play an open hat note, I pretty much do it that way because it's so much more interesting. Hey, if this video helped you out, become a fellow non-glamorous drummer and subscribe. Be sure to check out this other video on hi-hat technique as well before you go. Thanks guys, take care.